I think one of the most misunderstood areas of woodworking is wood grain, and exactly what wood grain is and what wood grain does and where it comes from and how it operates within the work that we do. And sometimes I think we do have to go back to the tree. We have to relook at the tree and understand what we're working with. We've got this organic substance that's been growing in the ground for multiple years, decades, hundreds of years maybe even, and it's growing upwards and it's reaching up for that sunlight, and it's got all of these idiosyncrasies going inside it that we very rarely see. Because when you say to somebody, oh, I just love wood, you're usually saying, I love wood, I like the feel of it, I like the look of it, but do you understand what's going on within the fibers, in the structure of the tree and things like that? So what I did many decades, maybe 3 decades ago, I started teaching people how to work with wood. And one of the first things I realized is they really didn't know what wood was. And they thought, for instance, as a quick instance, if you took something like an axe and a piece of wood, and you took it and you wanted to split this piece of wood, and you chop it all the time like this, you would have to make maybe 100 blows to get all the way through this piece of wood, because we're not looking at the grain correctly. But if we took the wood this way and take the axe and chop that way, then we can split the wood, and then we start to understand the grain. Then we start to see what's inside this piece of wood. How did this get here? Why? How is it working? And if we split it this way, we split it again, and watch what happens. You can see on this surface it's very undulated because of the growth rings. Here are the growth rings, hard and soft aspects to the growth ring. But then when we get inside, because I split this way, let's take a look inside. Look how much smoother the wood is. It's so much smoother. And when we're working with our wood and we want to plane it and pair it with a chisel and things like that, we have different things that are against us. So we're working against the grain sometimes and working with it at others. Here's an example for you. This is a piece of oak, and this one has grain that's, look at the direction of the grain. Let's split this a little differently. Let's take the axe and put it in the middle. I want to split this piece of wood clean in two, so I've got 2 exact size pieces and they look the same. Uh-oh, and look what happens. It went the wrong way. This is what happened. Now I can read the grain. Now this might seem obvious to you guys that have been working with wood for a few years or even a few weeks, but it's not so obvious when you're brand new at woodworking and you've never seen wood split. So this split completely differently this time, but look inside. It's not parallel, and yet on this edge it's nearer to parallel than this edge. So even in those 2 inches of wood, we've seen a diverse direction take place with the grain. And that's the important thing, that we have to understand what wood is. So I devised these little techniques just to show people what wood grain was. Now, when we're working with our wood, I'm going to put this high in the vise because it'll exaggerate what I want to show. If I took a saw, let's take a bigger saw, and I come into the end grain here with the saw, and I push this way. Listen. Can you hear it? It's... If I take less pressure here, you can... It's vibrating in the wood. If I go this way, it's a completely different sound. And that's because when I'm putting that wood in the vise that way, if I take my saw and I come onto the top of the grain like that, I'm grabbing those end grain fibers, and that's what's happening, magnified 100 times. If I go this way, it slices in between the fibers. So these are small things, but they're very important. This will give you a little bit of a better example, I think. If I took even a small saw and go onto this is the end grain, so if I go into the end grain this way, it grabs those fibers. It's grabbing those end grain fibers. If I change direction and I go this way, it slices in between. It's not grabbing onto the ends. These are all important parts of learning about wood. What about this then? So if we're sawing across the grain like this, if we start sawing, can you see how the teeth of this particular saw, because this is sharpened for a rip cut, how it grabs the fibres? Well, when you start sawing across the grain, you want to sharpen the teeth of your saw for a cross cut. And what we really want is a couple of knives like this. This will represent two saw teeth. And when they go across the grain, they sever the fibres very differently than when you rip between the fibres. So imagine all of these teeth crisscrossed all the way over here, and they're going into the fibres. They're separating off the fibres because the teeth of this saw are sharpened to a pinnacle point. They go to an absolute cutting point. And that's what we do when we sharpen our saws. Chisels when we start pear cutting, but there are so many things that we do with wood. If we want to split cut, say, let's just do this. Take a saw, cross grain cut. Now if I wanted to, I can also saw down this face as well like this, and I can saw down into the wood. But sometimes I might want to be advantaged by the fact that wood splits, just as we saw before. Use a chisel, yes. I can use an axe. Anything that will split cut that wood. I've got pretty close to where I want to be. I've taken advantage of the splittability of wood. If I go this way, I can now pear cut this surface, going with the grain like this to smooth up any undulation that's left, or I can go across the grain, and this is what we call pear cutting. So pear cutting with the grain and pear cutting across the grain, and we're advantaged by this the very nature of the grain, its ability to be split and pear cut and shaved and so on. So this is a wonderful way and experience for all of us to understand wood. What about this one though? This is one I really like. If I put this piece of wood in the vise like this, and then I take a straight edge to it like that, I'm straight, I'm dead straight. So I could plane this piece of wood, it would be fine. What happens if I put it in the vise this way? Let's take a look at this. Now, before I cinch this tight, I want to show that this is actually flat. So I've got a flat piece of wood, but watch what happens if I put the piece of wood a little bit higher in the vise, so that half of it is clamped in the vise. I'm still flat, but watch what happens when I start to apply pressure to the vise. Can you see there? I've got this huge camber in there. Now then, I've got this piece of wood clamped securely in the vise. I take my plane and I start planing this, thinking I'm taking out that hump in the middle. And I keep planing, taking the hump down. And I'm planing this piece of wood because I want it nice and flat for my box lid. And I check myself for flatness, and I'm still not flat, so I'm going to go until it's flat. And I keep going, like this, taking off the rise. And then when I think I'm ready, I release the pressure on the vise, and I've got this pretty flat. But watch what happens. Let me put that out of the way. When I take it out of the vise and I take my straight edge on there, I've got this huge hollow in there. This is the nature of wood. This is what experience tells us. Oh, we can't clamp it that way. We might be able to clamp it that way, or we might be able to clamp it on the bench top, but we can't clamp it in the vise because it will compress the fibres on one side and expand them on the other. So a pressure to one side, compression can be an extension on the other side. So these are all the ways that we should start to look at wood. Look at this here. We've got a knot on this edge. If we split the wood, it splits nice and straight. When we get nearer to the knot, it starts to distort a little bit more. We've got more contention around the knot. These are all ways of experimenting and understanding the nature of wood, and then, of course, explaining it to other people. So this is all part and parcel. This came to me when I started working with my students because they couldn't understand what was going wrong. What about this one here? We take this piece of wood, we want to file the corner off here, and we take the rasp and we start filing. Oops. Oh, look what's happening. I wanted this to be nice and smooth. What I should have done is worked with the grain. If I'd worked it this way, same pressure, I'm working with the grain. If I turn it around and come even on top of what I just did, now I can feel the incredible pressure because I'm not working with the grain. So there are things you do. If you split cut or if you start pair cutting this, I take my chisel this way. I can pair cut down here very nicely. I've got this beautiful straight edge, and I come down here to put a bevel on it, and I go across with my bevel. It's great, but what happens if I suddenly decide to come this way? Oh, look what I did. These are all part and parcel of learning what wood does and learning about the different components in a tree. The knots are going to steer you the wrong way. You have to work with it. Instead of split cutting, you would saw it. You would use these different methods. Files are the same. You do exactly the same with the file. Go against the grain and it's grabbing the wood all the way through. We learn about the nature of wood, we learn about the grain, and we learn about how the tree grows, and suddenly we experience this incredible ability to predict what the wood is going to do. Let me just explain one quick point to you. You probably saw me take the saw and tell you can't cross-cut with a rip-cut saw across the grain, but actually in this case I've got this very small tooth saw and I can rip-cut with it and I can cross-cut with the same saw, and that's why it worked in this case. When you get to larger tooth saws, it will not work. You have to have a specific tooth pattern for a rip-cut and one for a cross-cut.